Welcome back everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be going through my top lane tier list for the new 2025 season. Now I'm going to be going through every champion one by one, explaining my thought process behind it, and timestamping it all down below for you all. Now keep in mind this will be a general tier list that can apply for all elo brackets, but there will be some differences depending on your bracket. So for example, a champion like Maokai would be low B tier, in a lower bracket like gold and below, but really strong in higher ranks, which is why I've got him in A tier. Or a champion like Mordekaiser would be high A tier and lower ranks, but maybe even C tier or low B tier in high elo, which is why I've got him as B. So I'll explain it all as I go, but we're going to be starting things off with S tier. Now, the reason I've got Irelia as the number one champ at the moment, after her buff, it did take a while, I'd say, for people to figure out how strong she is, but she's just an extremely powerful blind pick at the moment. She's so strong in lane, and First Blood being even more important now on this patch, makes her even more valuable, and she's really strong early skirmishing too, so trying to get the early objectives, even breaking down the first tower. She's really good at everything you want in the early game on the current season. Now, I talked a little about her being a strong blind pick and what I mean by that, even though you might think that she's got so many hard matchups. A lot of the matchups that are bad for Irelia, so a matchup like Jayce is actually playable, matchup like Renekton, you can win the 1-5 quite hard. She doesn't really have any matchups that feel completely unplayable, where a matchup like Jayce vs Kennen or Jayce like Gragas, yeah, it's definitely doable. It's not a guarantee that you're going to get smoked, but they're still way harder than the counter matchups for the champions I've got here in S tier. Now moving on to Ambessa, very similar, really powerful blind pick. You're going to see the theme here. She is so strong in so many different matchups, and even her counter picks are not unplayable. So champs like Renekton, champs like Irelia are really good to Ambessa. There's definitely some outplay potential for you there. She spikes really hard early game, which is really important at the moment, trying to get the feat of strength from first blood, first tower, trying to secure early objectives. You really want to have a lot of power from top lane, so you can get the early grubs, of course, and first blood and tower. Anything you can do to contribute to that, especially at the moment, as it's just dropped, everyone is playing for that. Pretty much every game, everyone is grouping up around the third objective for a feat of strength, or trying to protect the tower. It's really important that you have a lot of early game power. Now for Cassante, also another really powerful blind pick, one of the best out there, really powerful melee champ, and really strong in early skirmishing. That goes without saying, not really much different here. The reason I've got him S tier compared to A tier before is early game power is even more important, where after the rework he became way more broken in lane, but a lot weaker out of lane. Not a lot weaker, but a lot less options I'd say out of lane, but the early game is just so important at the moment, that's why I'm going to be keeping him into S tier. Now, as for our final S tier champion, Riven, not much has changed for her. She's still going to be a really powerful solo queue top laner. She may not be as good of a blind pick as the other three in this list, which is why I have her last place in S tier. But her hard matchups, you should be banning Renekton anyway. But matchups like Poppy, matchup like Gragas, also neutralizes, definitely not going to completely shut you down out of the game. And this champion is so good early game, in a meta where first blood and early objectives are so important, this is definitely a great champion to play. Moving down to A tier and starting with Aurora, she's still one of the best blind pick top laners in the entire game, and that hasn't changed in this season. Early game is even more important now, where she's so powerful in lane and so oppressive to play against, so definitely still going to be a strong champion that spikes early and pretty much unbeatable in lane for most melees. Now as for Kennen, quite similar to Aurora, really powerful in lane, and he got a bit of an indirect buff with the new rune that gives you ulti damage, and that's in the sorcery tree as well, where Nimbus Cloak was okay on him, but nowhere near as good as the ulti damage is going to be, so he got a pretty big indirect buff as well. Now for Warwick, still one of the best melee blind pick top laners in the entire game for a melee champ, and that hasn't changed, still really strong early game, and with early game being more important, especially first bloods, where he's kind of the king of that. You can invade jungle 2v1 some game, or 1v2 some games, and not many champions can really beat you in lane, so he's going to be a strong champion still. Now for Jax, still a great champion, really good all-rounder these days. He has a lot of hard matchups, like Aurora, Kennen, Gragas. So many matchups that feel not unplayable, but really difficult to the point where you can get quite neutralized. He's still really strong though, he still spikes really hard and a good all-rounder. So good laner, good team fighter, so a really solid champion still. Now, as for Fiora, she's really strong in lane, and split pushing value has gone down a little bit, so I'm probably going to be deranking her as the season goes on. We're going to have to see, but for now, because her early game is so strong, I'm going to keep her right where she is, because again, she's got high blind pick ability, really high carry potential, especially if the game goes later on, and even though early game is important, with Baron not spawning until 25 minutes, that gives you a lot of time to get to that 3-item level 16 Fiora that feels unplayable to play against, so I'm going to be keeping her there for now. And for Darius, he's a pretty good all-rounder too. I'd say he's a pretty good blind pick, not the best out there, and has pretty good carry potential. A little bit similar to Fiora, with Baron not being up to 25, you can get level 16, and Darius is one of the best scaling melee champs in the game. So definitely he's going to have a good time. And of course, he's a First Blood King as well, so he gets a bit of an indirect buff there also. Now, moving on to Gwen, I would say the new item could be good on her. I'm definitely going to have to see a bigger sample size before I jump the gun. I think it might not be as powerful as people are thinking straight away, but she's still a good champ with really high carry potential, does really well late game, especially level 63 items, so I'm going to be keeping her in A tier for now. Moving on to Yone. Now, he does have a lot of hard matchups. He's a pretty hard champ to blind pick, unless you're just a Yone guy with insane amounts of mastery on him. But if you are, and you know how to play all the counter matchups, then you're going to have a really good time. He's still a really strong champ. He's not as good, I would say, at early game as a lot of these other champions, which is why I have him a bit lower. He's not as powerful in an early skirmish as a champion like Riven or a champion like Aurora, but he's still quite strong. He scales really well as well, and has really high carry potential for a top laner. Now, moving on to Jayce. This one is hard for me to place. If you were to ask me last patch, you know, a couple of days back, where Tank Jayce was running around, I'd put him S tier. I'd put him one of the best top champs in the game, but they did just nerf Unending Despair. So I'm going to have to see how the build settled. I'm guessing if I had to predict the build, you'd be going Eclipse, Fimbulwinter, Despair. I'm going to have to see more of it, or maybe people still just rush Despair anyway, even though it got nerfed. I'm definitely going to have to see more of a sample size. But despite that, he's still a great champion. You have options. Grasp and lane makes you quite strong as well in a lot of matchups, and Conquer in different ones. So definitely a good champ to have. Now, moving on to Gnar. I'm going to be putting him a bit lower, I would say. So if you're in lower brackets, I'd probably demote him to B tier, just because early game is so important, and his 1 to 6 is quite weak. He's still a great blind pick, which is why I've got him so high, and he still spikes extremely hard when you recall back or TP back to lane. Tier 2 boots level 6, and especially at Triforce, you can really start to blow up towers. But it does take a while for you to really come online on this champion, so I feel like he's not going to be as strong in the season. Now, moving on to Gragas. So his blind pick ability is a big selling point why he's so high on this tier list, and he is quite strong early game still, but the main reason he's so high is definitely that blind pick ability. Moving on to Rumble. Now, Rumble got quite a lot of indirect buffs with the new item coming up, Bloodletter's Curse, combined with the extra ulti damage, so he's going to have a really good time. Also, early game being really important, where this champion is so strong early game, so good in lane, so good early skirmishing, and with TP being more flexible, now you can TP around the map and make a lot of proactive players. I'll say Rumble's value has gone up quite a lot on this patch. Moving on to Cassiopeia. Now, Cassio is still a really powerful laner. You need to be a Cassio one trick or maybe a mid-main field top. That's probably a lot of Cassio. Still, that hasn't changed. And the boots change. We talked a little bit about it on my last video going through the patch. But the fact that she can't get tier 3 boots is not really a nerf per se. It's just not that nice for her, because the upgraded sorcerer boots are quite broken. And the fact that she doesn't have access to that, she does get some movement speed instead, which is not bad, and she doesn't have to spend money on it, but the boots are so strong that it feels quite bad not being able to get them, and she is quite good in lane, but it is quite hard translating your lead to the rest of the map, as you're not that strong in side lane, you're quite vulnerable, and if you have a mid lane control mage as well, you can make a lot of comps quite weird. Now, moving down to Renekton. The reason I promoted Renekton is not just because the early game is more important now, but also a lot of the strong champions in the meta. You can see champs like Riven, champs like Ambessa, champs like Irelia. Renekton shits on all of them. So he's a really good spot in terms of what people are going to be playing more often. He does really well into most of them, and the champs that shit on him, like Aurora and Kennen, are quite hard to play. So not many players can play them to the level where they can beat you if you have high Renekton mastery. Moving down to Vladimir. Now, Vlad is quite powerful in lane, especially if you take Ignite, he can be quite strong. He's not as good at early skirmishing as a lot of other champions here, but because the lane phase is so strong, and if you get fed, of course, you scale so well, you snowball really well. I'm going to be keeping him in A tier for now, but maybe moving him down to B tier later on. I do feel like Bloodletter's Curse can be good into tank matchups. I'm definitely going to have to test that though, so for now I'll be keeping him in A tier. Moving on to Camille. Now, Camille, the nerf a little bit a while back now, maybe a few patches back, was quite hard for her. She's still a good champion. She still has a lot of carry potential, don't get me wrong. We're not giving up on her yet. She's still quite good, but she just doesn't spike as early as a lot of these other champions. So her early game is actually not too bad, her 1 to 5, but then her level 6 to 9 is pretty awful, to be honest, if you don't have a lead. So a lot of champions that are going to be strong there, like a Renekton or a Riven or an Irelia, even Rumble or Aurora, they're just going to outperform you during that portion of the game, which can be quite important. And if you don't get an early lead, 1 to 5, if you've got somebody that's quite good, or if you're in a hard matchup, you're kind of chilling until Triforce, which you don't get until around 12 minutes. It's just way too late in the game now, with so much going on early, so I'll be keeping her in low A tier for now. Now, as for Akali, the reason I've given her a promotion, even though she still does have a lot of hard matchups, hard bruises like Renekton can be tricky, and even certain tanks, is I feel like the Bloodletter's Curse build can be good on her if you verse MR stacking tanks or something like that, and she's just a pretty underrated champion in general. She's really strong in lane, quite hard to play against for a lot of melee matchups, and even against ranged champions, she does better than most, so I'll be keeping her in A tier for now, and seeing how she settles on the patch. Moving on to Maokai. So I talked a little bit about him. He's just a really solid tank at the moment, probably one of the best tanks in the game. Even though Unending Despair did get nerfed, which is why I've got him a bit lower than I would have last patch. He's just so solid, he just really saves a lot of team comps. You have a really easy hard engage, there's not many unplayable matchups, and you're actually surprisingly strong in lane. So I'd be keeping him in A tier for now. He uses the Drain Tank build really well, the Despair, Fimbulwinter, and that hasn't changed even though Despair did get nerfed. He's still a really solid tank, but not really a champion that I'd ever want somebody to main, especially if you're in lower ranks. And for Malphite, I was considering demoting him as early game is important. You're not going to get first blood on Malphite, I would hope, unless you're playing against somebody that might be auto-filled. But Malphite, the only time you should be picking this champion is in a Malphite game. So if you see Jayce top, 80 carry mid, you know, Graves, jungle, something like that. Malphite's going to be completely insane in a lot of games versus a mobile or heavy AD comps. So if you only pick him in the right situations, I'll be saying he's an A tier champ. The reason he's not an S tier champ, if you only pick him in the right spots, is just because you're still a tank, you're still a bit team reliant, so even if you are in a great game, you still need to rely on your team a bit more on this champion than most. Moving on to B tier, and starting with Volibear, I'm quite tempted to put the bear up into A tier, but the reason I'm not is even though he is so powerful early game, and you can explode games, which is quite important in this meta, there are a lot of matchups that can be tricky to do so, especially ranged counter picks, and if you don't get fed early game, then your champion is pretty much useless. You don't provide much to a team comp if you're not ahead, and even if you are ahead, it's quite hard for the average player to know how to close out a game on this champion and really speed up the pace of the game, especially with Baron spawning so late. So for now, I'm going to be keeping him into B tier, but the reason he's so high in B tier is because his early game is so powerful. And moving on to Olaf, it still pains me to put my boy down into B tier, but he's just not in the best spot at the moment. Now, he's still strong early game, he's still a really good blind pick to be honest, but the reason he is not an A tier, or a bit higher, is just because he has a lot of mana problems, and even though Presence of Mind can help a little bit, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you get ganked or punished, especially if you run Flash Ghost, don't have TP, you can find yourself in a really bad situation. A lot of Olafs actually do take TP these days, myself included, just to kind of mitigate that disadvantage of if you ever get chunked or a bad trade or lose mana and don't get your recall off, you're just kind of screwed. TP really helps with how much, not weaker, but unstable his early game is these days. So I'll be keeping him B tier for now. His items don't feel as good at the moment as well, with Rev Hydra getting nerfed quite a couple seasons ago, and Stride Breaker getting nerfed last season. So I'll be keeping him B tier for now. Hopefully he gets a bit of an upgraded build later on. And moving on to Mordekaiser. Now, Mord's a champion that'd be really high A tier and lower elo brackets, as your lane phase is so strong, especially if you run Ignite, you can beat down a lot of melee champions, make it really volatile, really good at all-ins, and pretty consistent blind pick, I'd say. So I'll be keeping him in B tier because in higher elo brackets, there are a lot of really hard matchups that you have to play against, and the threat of this champion is not as scary, especially if you're not ahead and against high elo players. They can respect the range and they know how to kite you around the ulti. So definitely a champion that is really good in lower brackets, but not as good in high ones. You can still make him work, don't get me wrong, and he's probably going to feel a lot nicer with the new item, especially if you verse MR stacking tanks. But other than that, I'd say he's in a pretty similar position. Now, as for Udyr, early game is more important, which is why I gave him a little bit of a promotion into B tier. I still think it's hard to completely carry a game on him, and you need to really know how to push the pace of the game, so dominate your lane, proxy, invade the jungle, really be high pressure if you want to play this champion. But especially with TP being global, that's definitely going to be a better option for you. Now, as for Wukong, he's quite a powerful champion early game and really good in early skirmishes, but he's not the best blind pick. That's why I've got him in B tier, even though he is quite strong, especially in the right situations. But if you do verse an AP top, even a magic damage tank, like a Gragas, champs like Mordekaiser, can make your life quite difficult, so I'll be keeping him in B tier for now just because his blind pick ability is not as good as it could be. Now, as for Tryndamere, really good blind pick, really good at neutralizing a lot of matchups, but just not as strong early game as a lot of these other champions. He is still good, don't get me wrong, especially if he gets some lucky crits early on, but he's more so of a neutralizer proxy style, and he's not good in objective fights, so I think split pushes are going to be a bit worse. on the season, at least at the start of the season, while people are still contesting the feats of strength and the Artican stuff like that, you're not really going to be as useful in those types of situations where, of course, you can get first blood, you can blow up the town, so you can carry that aspect of it, but you're not that useful in the early objective fights. So the first 3 objective fights are quite important, and Artican, of course, everyone's going to be contesting that. So full split pushes like a Warwick, champs like Trundle, champs like Tryndamere, they're not going to be as good in the season in my opinion. Now, as for Zac, the reason I've got him in B tier, I believe he should be in A tier in higher brackets, but in lower elo brackets he's not as good, as he's kind of easy to play, hard to master type of champion. You have to really understand your limits in laning phase, as you can really pressure and bully down a lot of, especially melee top laners, and you spike so hard early, so useful in a team fight. So pretty good all-rounder champ, but you do need to have really high mastery and understanding of how to play your matchups in lane. Now, as for Teemo, he's pretty similar, you've probably heard me say it before, he's pretty similar to Kennen and Aurora, where he's just really broken in lane, but the difference between him and then, as out of lane, his champ's quite useless, right? Not many people are going to fall for the old shroom trick these days. Everyone will grab sweepers, they'll grab pinks. So translating your lead from lane into the mid game on this champion is quite hard, and in a team fight you're quite useless. So all these objective fights, he's not going to be as useful as most of the other champions above him. Moving on to Rengar. Now, he's in an okay spot at the moment. The problem with Rengar is he doesn't really have a build that he loves, and this season doesn't really change anything. Most Rengar players are rushing Ravenous Hydra and just using that to one-shot waves and roam around the map, which can be a good strategy, bully your lane opponent and roam around, but if you don't get fit on this champion, you're very useless, and getting fit on him requires really high mastery, as you really need to know how to squeeze out all the advantages you can in laning phase, because if you can't do that, your champion has a very low value. Now, as for Pantheon, really good early game champion, but there are just so many matchups that can neutralize you. Champions like Poppy, Gragas, Malphite, Maokai, just so many lanes you play against where they're way more useful than you at level 6 onwards, and if you can't get a lead against them, you're not going to have as much value. Now, you can roam around and be impactful, and you can get first blood in a lot of matchups, so he's not bad champ by any means, and in lower brackets I'll be putting him a little bit higher. Maybe high B tier, maybe low A tier, I have to see more of him, but for now I'll be keeping him where he is. Now for Garen, I'd say this champion is still nowhere near as strong as he was that one season where Stridebreaker was broken and it's 1v9ing every game. He's still a good champion, and in lower elo brackets I'd have him as an A tier pick, of course, maybe even S tier in the really low ranks. So still a great champion. The season doesn't change much for him. I'd say split pushing being not as good is a little bit bad for him, but games going longer is going to be nicer for him as well, with Baron not 20 to 25 minutes, so he's in a pretty decent spot, more of a middle of the pack top laner for higher ranks, and a really high ranked top laner for lower ranks. Now, as for Dr.Mundo, he got a bit of a nerf. I'd say the Warmogs build was really broken on him, rushing Warmogs, because once you had that, there wasn't really any matchup where they could give you any trouble, and you could even demolish tower in front of a lot of lanes. But now they made it so you have to go Warmog second. That doesn't mean the champion's bad, it just means that strategy of being able to blow up the tower and just tank all their damage is gone now, so he's not going to be as useful as he was before. Now for Aatrox, this champion is kind of average still. He can win, a few matchups, he does have some hard ones. I'd say he's the middle of the pack top laner at the moment. I'd be putting him dead in the middle on average, because even though he's strong, he can't really 1v9 a game as much as he used to be able to when he had items like Gore Drinker or Duskblade. So he's just a pretty solid champion. No build that he loves. There are some builds with Shojin or Eclipse that are good, but I'd say he's more of a middle of the pack top laner at the moment. Now for Gallia, this is a good counter pick to AP tops. You can be really impactful early game, but it's pretty hard to really carry the 1 to 5. Your early game's not that weak, I would say, but it's quite hard to kill champions like Kennen and Aurora, the AP range tops, and even champs like Rumble. You can kill them if they make mistakes, but I would say typically he's more of a neutralizer to AP lane bully champions. Now for Alawi, the champion is quite annoying to play against, but it can be quite hard to translate your lead and carry a game on it. And this champion, since split pushing is its main thing, with split pushing not being as valuable, with the first 3 objective fights being really important and Artican fight being really good, of course you can rock up to an objective, get tentacles down and be involved there, but you're just not going to be as useful as other champions. Now as for Set's a champion that I'd also put in A tier if this was a low elo tier list, because he's so strong early game, but translating your lead on Set is really difficult, as it's really hard to reach people and get onto them, and he has so many hard matchups up against high ranked players. If you blind pick Set and Masters Plus and you verse champions like Aurora and Kennen, but from really good players, you're going to have a really miserable time. Now for Tahm Kench, he's a pretty okay champion, I'd say, especially if you can get fed, you can make him work. But if you don't get fed on this champion, you have pretty much no value. That's why I've got him in B tier. He relies on snowballing really hard, and he doesn't really have much forcing tools to get fed, so I'll be keeping him B tier for now. And his team fighting is quite weak as well if you're not ahead, that's why I've got him so low in B tier. Moving on to Cleared, he's just got too many hard matchups for me to put him any higher. There are some really cool Cleared 1 tricks that make him work, and the champion's very fun, but there are just way too many hard matchups. A lot of melee matchups can beat you like a Jayce or a Fiora, and even a lot of range matchups like Kennen or Gnar can be tricky, so this is not really a spot for him where he feels amazing as a blind pick, and even as a counter pick, most of the time there are going to be better champs. And moving on to Cho'gath, he has a lot of hard matchups as well, I would say. Some hard melees, some hard range matchups as well. Champs like Olaf really shit on him, champs like Fiora can beat him. Not saying those matchups are unplayable by any means, but he's just not favored. If you blind pick him, you're going to be in a pretty tricky spot a lot of the time, so I'll be keeping him in low B tier for now. Moving on to Warwick. So like I talked about before, split pushing value is going to go down, so Warwick value is going to go down as well. But if you get really far ahead on this champion, you can definitely make it work. You completely annihilate towers, so maybe if people are too tunneled on fighting other kinds of stuff like that, maybe you play for bottom inhib or top inhib wherever it spawns, so you can definitely still make him work, but the split pushing value is going down because of how important the objective fights are, and also first blood being important, where your 1 to 5 on Warwick is very weak. Now moving on to Poppy. Poppy's okay, she's more of a neutralizer champion. This season doesn't really change anything for her. She's okay in early skirmishes, she's pretty good in lane, so I'd say she's more of a middle of the pack champion. I'd be putting her higher, but she's kind of situationally good. If you pick her in the right spot, if you see Camille Sin or Rakan Jax, you know, something like that, of course you're going to be a really broken gem. You'll be A tier or maybe even S tier in certain games. But on average, I'd say I'll be keeping her in B tier. She's more of a neutralizer that doesn't scale as well, and if you get ahead, it's quite hard to translate your lead and carry the rest of the map. Moving down to C tier, and starting with Gangplank, not much has changed from this season. He doesn't have a build he likes, he has quite a lot of hard matchups, so I'm going to be keeping him in C tier. His early game's not that good either. Of course, great players can make him work, like Solarbucker, climbs every season, but the average player is not him, so I'm going to be keeping him in C tier for now. Moving on to Trundle. Now this guy is the split pusher, and split pushing is not going to be as good in the season. There's just way too much to do, and you can have influence with first blood and first tower. If you beat your lane hard enough, you can kind of carry the feats to strength in that way, but it's not a consistent strategy, as you do have quite a lot of hard counter matchups. Range champions or even some melees like Jayce can be quite tricky. Now as for Nasus, the main reason he's here, his early game is so weak, you're going to be even more of a hindrance to your team in this season, and with split pushing being weaker as well, I might even demote him to D tier later on. Now for Ryze, I've spoken about this before, he is best used as a counter pick, really specifically to champs like Rumble and champs like Kennen. And how often do you verse a Rumble or Kennen blind pick for the average player? Very, very unlikely, so I'll be keeping him a C tier for now. It's not really worth putting the time into him, just for that really specific counter matchup, so that's why I've got him here. He's pretty hard to pick consistently. Now for Ornn, the reason he's so low is because he has very low carry potential. Don't get me wrong, sometimes your team needs a tank, so if you love playing Ornn, he's good to have in your pool, but I'd never want a player, the average player, to main Ornn, as the carry potential is just way too low, and this season doesn't change that. Now for Shen. Shen's also a champion with low carry potential, quite team reliant. He's a little bit stronger early game, but he's not that good in a team fight or an early skirmish. He's more so trying to create numbers advantages, but most people are going to rock up to the 20-minute Atakan fight on the dot, or even the third neutral objective fight if that's going to get you the feat of strength, and he's just not going to be as good as another tank or even another bruiser champ. Now for Yasuo, can work as a counter pick, but there are just way too many unplayable matchups if you ever try to blind pick him, which is why I have him as C tier, and even if you do get a good matchup, you're very easily campable, so it's really hard to win your lane versus your Gnar or whatever matchup you like, and surviving jungle ganks at the same time. Now for the triple 80 carries here, I'm going to categorize them together: Akshan, Quinn, Vayne. They can work if you get a matchup where you can just completely bully them down. You can make it work, of course. It's pretty hard to break the tower against a decent player playing one of these champions, even range versus melee. So it's pretty hard for you to bring value, and an early objective fight like a tier 2 Boots Vayne or Quinn, just not that useful compared to a Renekton with ulti or a Riven or something along those lines. So these champions, even though they can be quite oppressive in lane, and they're pretty good at blind picking, they just kind of ruin your team comp as well. No frontline, no CC, and no real ways to force big advantages. Now for Nocturne. Nocturne's a champion where definitely when they nerfed the Cookie's mana, even though Cookies are still strong, just in a different way. When they changed that, he did suffer a bit. He's got quite a bit of mana issues, and his early game is not weak, but it's not really strong enough to force early advantages, so I'll be keeping him in C tier for now, but keeping an eye on him. Now, for Briar, even though she's strong early game, you have to get fed, and there are way too many bad matchups for you to do that consistently, and this champion, if you're not fed, provides pretty much zero value to your team. Moving down to D tier, and starting with Cho'gath, you're going to hear me say something very similar for most of these champions, but they are really bad blind picks, most of them. So we'll start with Cho'gath, really bad blind pick, and really hard to survive early ganks on him. And even if you do get through the weak early game unscathed, get level 9 one item, you're strong, don't get me wrong, you're just not as strong as most champions above him. And blind pick ability is really important for me, especially in this season with the early game being so strong, so I'll be keeping him in D tier for now, but in lower elo brackets he could be C or maybe even low B tier. Now, for Singe, he's very similar, really weak early game, quite a lot of bad matchups. You can ignore them more so than Cho'gath and proxy around the place, but you're not really going to be ever able to get a lead on him, or at least Cho'gath in some melee matchups you might be able to bully them down, or if you hit enough Qs against a range champion, maybe you cheese a kill or two, but on Singe your lane phase is so weak that most of your strategy is based around proxying, which can be good, but I'd say it's just not going to be as useful in this season than the other champions above him. Now, moving on to Kayle. Again, blind pick ability and early game power. She has none of that. She's a little bit stronger level 1. But there are just way too many unplayable matchups. You can get checkmated really easily on her. So put in a position where you're guaranteed to get behind, dove by the jungler, or just ganked on a bounce back. So I'll be keeping her in D tier, as early game power is way too important at the moment. Now, for Sion, his 1 to 5 is quite weak. If you get past that unscathed, you do get to really get a bit stronger, especially around when you get some tank items under your belt. But this season doesn't really change much for him. He's still going to be a bit weaker, and even though they did change how the bounty gold worked, it's a bit nicer for you if you want to be proxy Sion. That strategy is really hard to work consistently, so I'll be keeping him in D tier for now. Now, for Skarner, I'd say this champion, you can cheese people, pull them into tower, but he's still a full tank champion, a bit team reliant for my liking. Maybe I'll put him higher later on, I'll see how he does on the new season, but for now I'll be keeping him into D tier. And for Karma, this champion's just way too team reliant. I probably underplaced her, to be honest. After seeing her now, I'll be probably putting her into C tier, as her blind pick ability is really high. But she's such a team reliant champion, and most of the time you pick her, you're going to be having a jungler like Graves or Kindred that can use his shields and the movement speed really well. So that's going to make you pretty much reliant on them to do well. If you pick Karma for your team and they do badly, it's really hard for you to be the difference maker, which is why I really don't value her as a solo queue pick. And as for Shyvana, you're going to hear me say it every single list most likely. This season doesn't change anything, she's still the worst top laner on the patch. Alright everyone, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the video. Now, the patch has only been out for a day, and even though I've been playing all day, I'm not going to have every champion completely locked in. Champs like Akali, I'm going to have to see a bit more of. Champs like Gwen, I'm curious to see how they do with the new build. But I'm pretty happy with how the majority of this list went, so if you have any questions at all, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.